assumption, we need to redefine the way we do church. Now, we're never going to get rid of all the big churches. We need big churches. They serve a function. There will always be some huge churches. But we need to really rethink the way that we approach what is a church in terms of its smallest definition. And then from there, we can build up to whatever the Lord wants to build up. But what is the essence of church? And so I think that in order to have something that you actually call church, there ought to be these 5 elements that are involved. Whether you got 3 people, 30 people, or 30,000 people, there ought to be worship. There ought to be community, the one another's of Scripture. Encourage one another, teach one another, pray for one another, build one another up. This doesn't happen very well in an auditorium with 2,000 people in it. And so we need to have these things happening one way or another. Where we've pastored big churches, we had home groups that acted almost as independent churches. There needs to be the Bible. The list of things that went on in the early church in Acts chapter 2 starts out with the apostles' teaching. We need the Scripture. There needs to be mission. There needs to be a sense of every member is a missionary. Everybody's a player. Everybody has some sort of outreach that they're a part of. We think of mission too often, we think of missionaries. Missionaries are a subset of mission. Me reaching out and having lunch with a gay man once a month with my wife, that's a mission. Somebody in the church that I used to pastor, a policeman in the church, young policeman, decided to spend his tithe money, instead of bringing it to our church, he would use his tithe money to go rent a small space in Skid Row, in a place where there was drug addicts and prostitutes, and they started a church called PS 150, for let everything that has breath praise the Lord, Psalm 150. And they started a church that the members were drug addicts and prostitutes. And they were slowly seeing people come to Jesus. And all of the ministry functions in the church were done by the residents of the community who were drug addicts and prostitutes. And some people criticized that. We saw wonderful things happening there. So part of mission for our church, a very small part, was we taught everybody in the church, whenever you go to a hotel, I mean, you guys just came from a hotel, if I could go in and look inside of all your suitcases, I know what I would find. I would find shampoo, I would find soap, I would find lotions, I would find all those little things that they put in there because everybody, and this hotel was interesting, it had a sign that said things to do before you leave, make sure you steal all the soap and stuff, right? It's not stealing, you paid for it. But we taught our people, every time you stay in a hotel, collect that stuff. And we would give it away through this other little church, PS 150. That was a small way of getting people to start to get involved in mission. And then we would challenge them to do larger things. Do you guys know about a thing called Operation Christmas Child? We pushed Operation Christmas Child. When I was pastoring a couple thousand people in a big church in Hawaii, we made sure that our church did 10% of all the giving to Operation Christmas Child for the whole state. And it was a monster goal for us. And we would push, and my wife and I would do like 24 boxes each. And I'd get them to talk about it. And by the way, you could go, we have a discount store called Walmart. Most everybody's heard of Walmart. If we would catch Walmart in the summer just before school started, for $104, I could get enough of school supplies and toys to fill 24 boxes. Any American can afford $104. And so we would push it really, really hard. Now, is that all we want to do is buy shoe boxes for Operation Christmas Child? No. What we want to do is get the lazy Christians doing something. Because if they do something, they'll do something else. And so we look for places to start. But to be a church, there needs to be mission, and everybody needs to be involved in mission. I think to be a church at all, there should be multiplication. There should be multiplication of disciples, and I think there should be multiplication of churches. Now, it's a really good thing I'm not God, because I would be really hard about this. I would say you're not a real church until you've planted a church. You're an almost church until you planted a church. I know some Bible schools in Australia where you go to Bible school and you are allowed to go to 3 years of a 4-year Bible school, and then you have to go plant a church, and now you can come back for the 4th year and you can graduate. So nobody ever gets to graduate from the Bible school without planting some kind of a church. Big one, small one, whatever, they have planted a church. That's a little rigid, but I think that we ought to really begin to realize that we're not really living the whole gospel unless we live the whole gospel. And part of the gospel is making disciples who make disciples. And if you do that, you're going to make churches that make churches. And so we need to think about that. And then I think that tithing is a part of the package. The book of Malachi says you're robbing God if you're not tithing and bringing it into the storehouse. I think that if you don't have this going on, you're not really a church. And I think if you're not pushing on these things as a pastor, you're not really a pastor. Go ahead. And do you hear what he's saying? The whole concept of worship was serious. There's 2 things I want to say about that. The first thing is, you can tell worship's a hot button for me. Singing and worship are not the same. Worship is Romans 12, verses 1 and 2. I present my body as a living sacrifice to God. Singing is one of the ways we do it. But there's probably 35 ways we do it. Tithing is one of the ways that we do it. And so worship is far more than singing. And we in America have made worship into put on a song and dance show. You know, if you don't have, in America today, if you don't have smoke and colored lights like a nightclub going while you're singing songs about the Lord, that's not considered worship. So I've been attending a church, which I've since quit, where they got the smoke, the colored lights, and the hip rock band, and none of the people in the audience are singing a word. Now don't tell me that's worship at all. Maybe the band's worshiping, but for sure the people in the audience aren't worshiping. So I think we make a mistake if we equate the two. But here's the other thing. I think that on day 1, how many did you have come to that Bible study the first day? 12. Okay. I would bet $500. I forgot your first name. John. I would bet $500 that on day 1, in John's mind, were all of these things. Right? I just won the bet. You guys owe me. So here's the deal. Here's the deal. That's a church from the first day. Even though they're not doing all these things, it's in his mind to do them. It's the intent of the group to do those things. So I don't think you got to be doing everything, but you got to be pushing for everything. Am I making sense when I say that? And so, but I see a lot of pastors that don't have these things going on inside their head. There's a. I'm getting ready to try to write a little book on how to teach your people to tithe. And I found out there's a whole bunch of Christian books now about why tithing is not biblical, or not tithing beyond the cross. That's the title of one of the books. It's crazy, and the arguments that they go through, it's really funny. There's a thing in apologetics called Occam's razor, and basically what it is that if you're going to seek truth, look for simplicity, because the simplest answer about creation is the right answer about creation. If you got to make a big complicated argument against something, the complication probably tells you already it's not right. You ought to read these books about why you shouldn't tithe. They are the most complicated things you have ever seen, and they come up with these conclusions about why you shouldn't tithe. So I'm going to say this, that the pastor who's preaching against tithing, I'm not going to call that a church. But watch this. The pastor who says, oh, church multiplication, that's for nutcases like Ralph Moore. Now, if you're trying to plant churches, and you're failing at it, well, that's to me as good as planting churches, because you're trying to do the will of God. But if you're going, no, 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 we don't want to do that, that'll cost money, we're going to get big, then I don't think you're a real church. I think you're a show. Can I say that any more bluntly? I mean, I'm soft-spoken and don't say what's really on my mind. But I think a whole lot of what I would go to convention, and this guy's held up as the example of what we're supposed to be, and I'm going, that ain't even a church. There's something wrong here. And there's something wrong with the denominational leadership that's trained by example. They're training people. You don't do what the New Testament is all about doing. So I think we got to really rethink what we're going to call a church, and then in doing it, what I'm going to say is we start at the micro church level, because with 3 people you can do all of this. With 5 people you can do all of this, and with 10,000 people you can do all of this. Let's do it all, but let's get it down to where we make it valid for somebody to start with 7 people in a restaurant and call that church. And we begin to expand beyond our borders. We're sending missionaries who are those bridge people, bicultural people. Whether it's an ethnic thing, it's a socioeconomic thing, we got people in Hawaii that are nutcase surfers. And surfers on Sunday morning ain't coming to church, they're in the water. So let's send the bicultural person who comes to our church but who's also a surfer. Let's have that guy go start a surfer church. We've done this, meet on the beach. One of the guys that we had in Hawaii moved to Michigan. Do you guys know the United States geography? Michigan is worse than Scotland. I mean, Michigan is like Finland or Sweden. It is cold. And so he went out and started a group of surfing on Lake Michigan. And I saw pictures of him coming. He's wearing a full, you know what a wetsuit is, right? That surfers wear. He's got a wetsuit that's got a whole hat on it. And I've never seen one of these before. I've seen them in California with a little hat thing. But this one had a little brim on the hat. And they're coming back. They got the surfboards on their head. They're coming back from a day of surfing. There's icicles this long hanging off the top of his thing. These guys are crazy. They're out there surfing in this incredibly cold. And then, in their wetsuits, because you got it to survive, they sit on a beach and have church together. Well, if they're doing all this stuff, I think it's a real church. I think it's a real church. And I think we ought to be proud that some bicultural person who's comfortable in a middle-class church is comfortable out there freezing his head off with a bunch of surfers. I think that's a good thing, because otherwise those people are never going to find Jesus. They're going to hell. Anyway, you can tell I get excited about this. Some micro-churches replace sermons with self-discovery of the Bible. I think this is really important. I ran into a guy who he Xeroxes. He'll take a chapter of the Bible and he Xeroxes it in the Living Bible, the old Living Bible, because it's so simple. It's not very accurate, but it's really easy. Anybody can understand it. And then he takes a modern translation, an accurate translation, and he gives it to you in both. And he hands it out Xerox, and he says, read this, both of these, 5 times this week, and write notes as the Holy Spirit speaks to your heart. Then you come back together, and we ask questions. What did the Spirit say to you? What are you going to do about it? How can we help you? That's the sermon. And so here's a guy, he's a plumber all week long. He comes in, he works maybe 10 hours on Tuesday, but Tuesday night they have church, and he's exhausted. He doesn't have to prepare a sermon. The people are the sermon. And better than just he gets out of preparing a sermon, the people have actually had to interact with the Word of God rather than to come to church and hear 30-minute talk and go, oh, that was a wonderful sermon, Pastor. They've spent a couple hours during the week meditating on the Word, which is the thing that God says is going to cause you to grow and thrive and prosper. And that church goes places doing that thing. And then I talked to you about some micro-churches tithe toward the outside needs because they have no inside needs. They don't need money. They send their tithe outside, and they ask everybody to tithe individually. Ruby's trying to say something to me, and she's the boss. Yep. We used to sing in our small groups, and then we found out that if we sing, we don't pray. We sing at the beginning, and we run out of time at the end, so we don't have time for prayer. So we quit singing because we sing on the weekend, and we would spend more time in prayer at the end of the meeting. And one time, a pastor from Japan, who I've been teaching this kind of stuff to, showed up into our group, and he didn't speak very good English, and I don't speak hardly any Japanese. And so, but he wanted to come to our small group, and so he came, and we're sitting there, and we get the thing going and everything, and pretty soon the meeting's coming to an end, and he starts crying. And so I'm trying to ask him why he's crying. He's trying to tell me why he's crying, and it doesn't work very well because we don't speak each other's language. And then later on, I get a Japanese person to translate, and I found out he cried because we didn't sing. And the reason that he cried because we didn't sing is this. In Japan, they have very small apartments. They have very thin walls. The neighbors hate Christians. And if they sing in a small group, the neighbors are going to get mad and call the police. And so he's crying for joy because now he can do small groups in his church because he thought you had to sing if you did a small group. And he's all excited because you don't have to sing. I can go back to Japan and start small groups in my church. And so he's crying. Now, come back to this. Here's what we've learned to do. We start every meeting with food. And in the small groups. If I was doing micro church, same thing. We're going to start with food. I beg people, if you got to buy food, I mean, single guys always buy food, right? But bring leftovers. Because if you bring a half a cake, we're going to go, where'd you get the cake? Oh, it was my daughter's birthday, and you're going to tell a story about the thing, and we want the story because it's part of your life. But while we eat, the first half hour or so, we're eating together, and what's happening is people are worshiping the Lord by going, hey, I prayed for you last week. What happened? Well, the Lord did this. Is that worship? That's worship. And so those kinds of things, I think, if we start to look at those definitions, and we start with 2 or 3 gathered together in Jesus' name, and then we scale up from there. How can we take what we do when there's 3 of us in a room, and we're going to do it with 4,000 people in a room? We're going to find out a way. You'll figure out how to do that. But what we've got to do, I think, is get our eyes off of, I'm a failure because they're big. I'm a failure because we don't have a lot of money. I'm a failure because we can't put on the kind of show they put on in America, and go, no, I'm a raging success because of this, and I'm going to do more of it. And if God makes it grow big, well, then you'll figure out how to make it grow big. Don't worry about that. Sreka.
About a month and a half ago, a couple of our young leaders, just hands up, those who were there. You see these guys. So we had breakfast at McDonald's. Yay! He loves McDonald's. And we were just discussing John 4 and about, worshiping God in spirit and in truth. And we just closed our eyes and we just invited the Spirit of God there. And the presence of God was so strong. We didn't sing any songs, but interestingly, there was quote unquote secular songs going on the, on the not microphone, you know what I mean. And very, very interestingly, the Lord ministered to some of the guys through that song. The Lord spoke to them through that song. I think, there were a couple of you who said, yeah, God spoke to me through that verse, through that. So it's like, I just wanted to share that it is doable. It is, I think sometimes we get so caught up in the religious aspect of it that we miss out on the real spirit thing there. So
That's good. That's really good. And McDonald's is, by the way, a really good place to start micro churches. Because they'll let you stay there for a long time. Some restaurants, they want to get you out of there, but McDonald's, you stay there. So we use that very effectively in Japan to start churches. Okay, so let's go further. Assumption. Micro churches build around freelance pastors. Now, I want to talk about tent making in Corinth and the difference between what I call bivo or bivocational and freelance. We have always started churches with pastors who had a secular job, and they started the church on the side. When we began doing that, we were the only ones we knew doing that. We started churches with guys who didn't go to seminary. We discipled them in the church, and then they still had to keep their job because we didn't have any money, and it was working pretty good. And then we met a man named Carl George, and we invited him to come and speak to our group. And when he came, he introduced to this word bivocational. In other words, you got two vocations, two jobs. One is a pastor and one is a secular job. And we all thought, this is really cool. Now there's a word for what we do. We're bivocational pastors. That's a really good thing. I lived in Hawaii for a long, long time. I come back to the mainland, and I find out that most pastors look at the word bivocational as a bad word. And they see it this way. You went to seminary, you spent all that money, you got all that education, somebody handed you a church that already existed, and then the church, under your leadership, can't afford to pay you a salary, so you got to go get a job. You're a bivocational person. And all your peers, the other pastors, sort of treat you as a loser. Like you failed, so you had to get a job. That's what bivocational has come to mean. And so I was trying to change that and promote the idea of we start micro churches with bivocational pastors. And one of my friends interrupted me. He's a real quiet man, but he interrupted the teaching. He was also teaching in the same deal. He goes, Ralph, you got to stop saying that word bivocational because people think that's a bad word. You got to start to use the word freelance. And I'm going to tell you in a minute why I use the word freelance, because America is really pushing into the whole idea of freelance. But I want you to think of this and write some notes about this. Write the word bivocational and write the word freelance. And I want you to think of the Apostle Paul in Corinth. When Paul first went to Corinth, he needed to earn some money. What did he do? He was a tent maker. Okay, so he's an apostle who ran out of money. So he's got to be making tents, just like some pastors ran out of money, so they got to drive Uber. He's bivocational in the way that people think of bivocational. Who did Paul work for in Corinth? Who was his boss? Aquila. It says so in the Bible. So when Paul was a tent maker, he wasn't just a tent maker, he worked for a guy named Aquila. Aquila had a career making tents. Aquila did ministry as a freelancer. Paul's the bivocational, Aquila's the freelancer. Actually, I'd like to throw away the word bivocational and just say freelance. But Aquila is a career guy who does ministry on the side. Most of you in this room, that's what you are. You already had a job. God did something in your life and you end up planting a church. And so you're a freelance pastor who's a career at whatever else it is that you do. I was just talking to, is it John? I forget names like crazy. He's got a job, a government job, right? That's his career. He pastors as a freelance pastor. And think about this. Think about the heroics of this. He's willing to put time, his own time into the church. He's getting paid for the other thing. But think about this also. he's actually bringing money to the church. First, he tithes to the church, but the church doesn't have to pay his medical insurance. They don't have to pay his retirement. They don't have to pay all these things. He's bringing financial capital into the church. He's a hero. He's a hero. We need to really rethink these things, especially if we're going to start a lot of churches rapidly, because that's really what we're talking about. If 3 was a slow year, how could you guys start 15 churches in a fast year? Because it's possible if you're willing to do it. So here's the deal about the freelance and Bible thing. More than 53 million Americans, which is 34% of the workforce, work as freelancers. In other words, they have a career and they're doing a business on the side. Now, I'm not talking about freelance pastors. I got a career and I'm trying to start an internet business. I got a career, I'm starting a graphics business. I got a career, I'm running a boat on weekends taking people scuba diving. I've got a career, I'm doing, whatever it is that they're doing, they are freelancers. And it's 34% of the people who have a job in America are also doing a freelance business on the side. We as the church ought to jump on the terminology that they're using, because that's becoming accepted in terms of the vernacular of our culture. More people work as freelancers in America. Listen very carefully to this. There's 50 states in the United States. If we put them in descending order, it's going to be California is the biggest, and then New York, and then after that, Texas. And it's going to work its way down, and you're going to get to the smaller states like Connecticut and Rhode Island and Hawaii. The states with Wyoming has very few people living in it. If you draw a line between the top 25 states and the bottom 25 states, there's more people in America with freelance income than live in the lower number of 25 states. Think about that. Half the states in America, tally them all up, the small states, and you get about the same number of people as who are already doing freelance jobs. It's mammoth. Look at it this way. We had 2 presidents, Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton. Both of them were elected, especially Bill Clinton by the second time by a landslide, Ronald Reagan by a landslide. There are more people with freelance jobs than voted either for Ronald Reagan or for Bill Clinton. This is a very significant number of people. And the church is sitting outside looking at its freelance pastors and calling them losers. We look at everybody else in society and go, man, that guy's a hustler. He's got a job, but look at this business he started on the side. In fact, when I moved from California to Hawaii, one of the problems that I went through in terms of you just kind of culture shock, everybody that I knew in California had some kind of a little side business going on. Everybody. I was pastoring a church of 3,000 people, and I was running an auto restoration business in my garage. I earned enough money in that business that I could go out and buy a second house. And I was pastoring this big church, but on Mondays and Tuesdays I was fixing cars. Everybody I knew was doing something. Now Americans actually have a word for this. They call it your side hustle. And so let the church be the side hustle. Instead of looking at the heroic bivocational guy as some kind of loser, let's call him a freelancer and start to get excited about the fact that he's willing to make the sacrifice, because there is a sacrifice involved. Millennials, the young generation that everybody in America is all worried about, they're a higher percentage of millennials do freelance work than of the general populace, 43% versus 34%. So if you're worried about what will the culture think if we're all working bivocationally or as freelancers, the millennials for sure are going to like you. In fact, here's one of the things that we've learned about millennials. They hate big churches. They hate churches that have expensive buildings. They hate churches that spend money on colored light shows, and everybody's doing the colored light shows to reach the young millennials. And here's why. Why do you spend all that money on that when there's people starving in Africa? You Christians are hypocrites. You're always talking about the love of Jesus, and all you can do is spend money on your stupid buildings. I'm not giving you my money. And now we can't figure out how come young people don't tithe to churches? Because Christian young people would rather give their money to something overseas that's going to feed somebody. Here's what's wrong with that. Putting your money overseas to something that's going to feed somebody isn't necessarily going to get them to heaven. But if our churches would wake up and not waste money on buildings and start to spend the money on ministry, we could feed people and get them to heaven at the same time. And young people would go, I want to be a part of something like that. And I know because I did it in my church and they were excited about it. I'm old. I'm older than dirt. And she's older than me. There was a time in our life that my wife was twice as old as me. When she was 1 year old. But we started a church. Actually, it started as an extension church. I was pastoring the big church, but I was in the process of handing off to the next generation. And so I would preach at the beginning 3 times in the big church and then go to the extension 25 miles away. We started a movie theater. And we decided we're not going to even ever think about owning a building. We're always going to rent buildings. So we're going to stay in the movie theater as long as we can. They do all the janitor work. They pay for the energy. They pay the electricity. They pay for the water. They pay for the air conditioning. They fix everything up if it breaks. And so we pay a lot of money to rent the theater for 5 hours. But if you think about all the stuff we don't have to do, it's pretty cheap. And so we did that. We didn't want to have an office, because if you have an office, you got to hire a receptionist. And we didn't want to spend money on a receptionist. So we didn't have an office. We rented a little mailbox. And then we rented a public storage where we could put all our, sound system and stuff like that. And then we started teaching the people, the city of Honolulu is our campus. If we want to have a banquet, there's this hotel over here. If we want to have a baptism, you go to where Kilauea Street meets the ocean. That's our baptistry. And then if we're going to have home group meetings, well, almost half of them meet in homes. The rest of them meet in shopping malls and McDonald's and places like that. If you added up all the real estate that our church is using, we're a church of 300 people. We have over $1 billion worth of real estate. And we're paying for very little of it. If you want to get rent space at McDonald's, go in and buy 5 Cokes. You get to use McDonald's for 3 hours. That's cheap rent. And so we did this whole thing, but then we bragged about it. We're not going to waste money on a receptionist. Our staff, we had 2 full-time people and 3 part-time people. We all lived all over the island, but we all got cell phones, and we all got email, and we all got WhatsApp. So we're in contact. We don't need an office. We're not going to have an office. And so that's how we ran the church. But then we did things like this. We send a team to Kenya every year. We do a best job we can going around and collecting people's used prescription glasses so they can be given away for free in Kenya. And then if we run out of used prescription glasses, go buy those cheap ones that you get at the drugstore. And we found all the cheap places where you can get them for like $1 a pair. And we would go and put glasses. We sent 2 eye doctors to Kenya with a team. We'd put glasses on over 2,000 people every year. They would have over 800 people every year accept Jesus. And I didn't believe in that. I started hearing this, we had 800 people got saved this year, and next year another 780 people got saved. I'm thinking, no, you're just going back, the same people are getting saved all over again. After 5 years, I found out they never went to the same village twice. So they really were having 800 people a year accept Jesus. The lay people from our church went and taught one pastor how to take home groups, start home groups, and then use them to raise up leaders and plant churches. And they planted 4 churches in 5 years in Kenya. And so we were sending like 20 to 22 or 3 people a year to Kenya. And here was the rule. Nobody in our church pays more than $1,700 to go on any mission team anywhere. So that means if you go on a mission with Ralph to Japan and it costs $1,300, you pay the $1,300. You go on a mission to Kenya, it costs $4,500, you pay $1,700. Nobody pays more than $1,700 for any missions trip at all. And I want you to know that the millennials in our church thought that was the coolest thing in the world, because here's a church that doesn't want to waste money on buildings. They want to spend money in Kenya helping people get eyeglasses and helping people find Jesus. And the millennials in our church were tithing. And so as we begin to make these value shifts, we can change the way that church is going to be. And you guys are perfectly set up for it, because you don't have all the baggage of some great big building that you got to pay a mortgage on. You're looking pretty good. Don't get one. So anyway, the last little part about this, I put churches should hop on the Freelance Express. The plane's about to take off, and the question is, will you be on board when it does? Is this good so far? Okay, I got just a couple more, and I'm going to... I'm going to talk about the last two after I give you a little time to talk to each other. I want you to turn, and we're only going to take 10 minutes to do this. And so I want you just to turn very quickly and go, here's the one thing I just heard in the last 45 minutes that's significant to me. And whatever it is, I want you to write it down. Go for it and do it fast, and we'll come back and we'll finish up.